Hi everyone and welcome to part 2 of my underrated video games marathon, because as promised, the next underrated awesome video game that I'll review is Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade. And this game is incredible! This game is fantastic. It is better than 90% of video games today. Probably actually 95% of video games produced today. This game is especially perfect if you love Knights Templar like me. That's right. And you know what else? While before this game was practically completely inaccessible, in 2021 it has finally been released on Steam. So it is pretty accessible now, and this game is by far one of the best PlayStation 2 games, better than 95% of video games produced today, and I totally think you should totally get it on Steam and play it, because it's fantastic, especially if you're a Knight Templar fan. Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade is an awesome game. During PlayStation 2 era, it was only released in Europe, which means that most of the world wasn't able to initially play it, and that is possibly, partially at least, why the game is so underrated and not really well known. But thankfully, in 2021, Knights of the Temple finally seen worldwide release on Steam, and I suggest you get it. The game does kind of give vibes of Dark Souls in terms of atmosphere and several gameplay elements with themes of Crusades and Templars, but don't misunderstand it. This is not a Souls-like game, just several similar elements.
I wonder if...
You play as Paul, a Knight Templar, on his journey to save an innocent young girl, his childhood friend Adele, who was kidnapped by a corrupt bishop who sold his soul to the devil. Adele has been given divine powers by God at childhood, and the bishop needs the girl's divine powers to release the devil upon the world. Paul has also to stop the evil bishop who turned against the Catholic Church and started worshipping Satan and wants to release him upon the earth. And through her divine powers, Adele guides Paul on his quest to defeat the evil bishop and rescue her. The story might sound pretty paper thin, but I don't mind this at all in this game. Not every game needs super deep storytelling, although the themes of this game, I say, are actually pretty deep, especially if you are a Christian. Even more so if you are a Catholic like me. If I had to pick a game that is perfect for Roman Catholics in general, I say Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade is definitely it. I would very much consider this game Roman Catholic. Though I won't discuss it too deep, because again, this channel isn't about religion. Plus, I think even if you aren't a Christian, it's still a wicked fun hack and slash that should really give you a very good time. This is very much a type of game that I think could apply both to religious and non-religious. You really don't have to be religious to enjoy this awesome game. And I also really love how parts of the story are told through Renaissance-style paintings depicting events that are happening, or events in the flashback.
I saw with surreal clarity what must be done, and was surprised to feel no hesitation. I was awed by the strength of Adele's will, which kept the forces of hell at bay.
The game starts in Europe, in Belmont Monastery, very likely a reference to Castlevania. And where in Europe the monastery is located? It is not stated, but I like to think it's in France. Belmont is very French after all, and Knights Templar were most active in France, plus Adele, that sounds like a pretty French name. Yup, I like to think it's in France. Later you travel to the Holy Land on a crusade where you fight Saracens, and later you even travel to hell itself where you fight actual hell demons. And their designs are wicked. Like, some of them are pretty unsettling, and those, I would say, kind of resemble the Pale Man from Pan's Labyrinth. There are like 28 levels in total in this game. Some are very short, but few are pretty long. And I say the length of the game itself is perfect. The game is not too long, not too short either. The length is perfect, as is the pacing. The game is also very linear, and I love all the level designs. The Belmont Monastery totally evokes the feel of a medieval European monastery. And much later in the game, you return to Belmont Monastery, although at this point it has been taken over by the bishop and the forces of hell, and it looks very different. It is recognizably the same place from the beginning of the game, and yet it feels very different. And the Holy Land very much feels like it too, with the buildings and the architecture. And the hell levels are really, really scary. And some demon designs, as I already said, are really creepy and unsettling and awesome. Every level is a little different from the other, and not one level feels like a rehash of another one. Every level feels unique. In order for Paul to heal himself or use some other ability, he has to use the power of prayer, fitting considering the themes of this game. You can also pick up some healing ointments that either enemies drop or you find them by breaking things. And the combat is also pretty good. It is simple and yet it is a lot of fun. It is very violent and you clash your swords with your enemies like in medieval fights between knights. And enemies' death animations are pretty good and varied. Sometimes they do a backflip while flying in the air if you give them hard enough sword slash, or other times you stab them while they are on the ground, kind of similar to how I remember it was in EA Lord of the Rings games, but it's way more violent here. You also have some variety of weapons, either a sword, an axe, or a bow. I generally prefer to use a sword if I can. Sometimes using a bow is unavoidable to solve some puzzles in the game. As you progress further, you pick up a new weapon, each more powerful than its previous version, and the final sword you pick is the Grandmaster Sword. Perfectly makes sense.
That sword looks strong and sharp.
There is surprisingly a decent amount of variety of enemies in this game, and fighting them is really fun. You first fight crazy monks in the Belmont Monastery who clearly were corrupted by Lord Bishop, and afterwards when you leave the monastery you fight city knights, and then when you go to Holy Land you fight Saracens, back in the days where people were not so overly sensitive to everything. I doubt such a game would pass in the modern age, but those were the days. And as I said already before, you even fight hell demons when you start exploring hell itself, and I love how awesome and grotesque they look. I already been talking about it. There are several boss battles too, with the first being this executioner in the Belmont Monastery, and later a Saracen leader who admittedly doesn't look that much different from other Saracens and who isn't even that hard. Black Knight accompanying him is actually much harder. And later there are also two knights, Black Knight and Hell Knight. And the final boss is of course the Lord Bishop himself, and he is pretty challenging. Even on the lowest difficulty, he can actually give you a really hard time in a couple of tries. Speaking of difficulty, I really like the names for modes in this game. Easiest is Peasant, then there's Squire, then Knight, and finally Templar is the hardest. I love that. I actually haven't even tried Templar yet because the game is already pretty challenging even on the easiest difficulty. I rarely do it myself and I rarely even say it, but trust me, this is I think one of those games where I truly suggest you should start on the easiest difficulty on your first playthrough. As I said, even Peasant is already pretty challenging. I mean, I do suggest you can bump it up harder once you beat the game on your next playthrough, but on your first, I suggest do Peasant. The visuals and graphics in this game are pretty good. Sure, they do look a little dated. I mean, it's a PlayStation 2 game, so obviously they are bound to look a little dated, but some older visuals age terribly, and some age well enough to still look pretty good. And I say Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade very much falls into the latter category, kind of like first two God of War games on the same console. Like, cutscenes are really good, they move the story forward, and I think the textures are good. And music is also good and atmospheric, and it wonderfully fits with the game's story and themes. Like, I love how when Paul is low on health, You first hear church bells and then church choir, which fits perfectly with what is happening. I already mentioned it before, but I also love how parts of the story are depicted through paintings. It only adds more atmosphere to the game. Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade also got a sequel, which was simply called Knights of the Temple 2, and it did have some good ideas, but due to gameplay and graphics, it sadly wasn't that good. Like, just look at those graphics. If you compare them to the graphics of the first game, yup, they look pretty bad, even by the standards of when they were made, because this game was made like in 2025, a year after the first one, and yet it looks so inferior. But still, the first Knights of the Temple is awesome, and that is all that matters. I love Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade. There are very little video games with religious themes, but I say Knights of the Temple is a perfect Christian game, and it's also a perfect Templar game. If you've always been dreaming about a perfect game where you play as a Knight Templar, then look no further than Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade. And where to get this game? It's on Steam! It's very easy now. It's on Steam. Sure, in the past it was only released in Europe, but now you should just find it on Steam. It's right there.
Wow, holy smoke!
And the next and the final underrated game will be also about Knights Templar, and it will be called The First Templar, and that will be my final underrated video game in the marathon. And yes, as the title points out, as I just said, it's also very much about Knights Templar. So if you are looking for a perfect Templar game, then again, look no further than Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade or The First Templar, but that we'll talk about in its own review. But go ahead and buy Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade on Steam, and thank you all of you for checking out this video game review. Press the like button, please subscribe to this channel, and I will talk to you soon in the review of The First Templar, another awesome Templar game. Talk to you in the review of The First Templar. See you then!